This is easily one of the most scariest and most iconic moments ever in the history of video gaming. Back in 1996, when the first Resident Evil game was released, nobody was prepared for what was actually to come with this game, even myself included. I didn't play it for a couple of months until early January 1997, and it just blew me away because it was one of the first games I'd ever played on the PlayStation, and I was just completely in awe of what was actually possible with games in general. And this game is my most favourite game of all time, and it solidifies why I love the PlayStation 1 so much. This game really truly is unique, and it set a whole genre of what is now known as the survival horror genre. Even though it originally started with the likes of Alone in the Dark, but it was Resident Evil that set the format for what was to become. The very fact that you were actually trapped in a secluded mansion, pretty much in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by monsters and zombies that were infected with an unknown virus that were running rampant throughout the entire vicinity, and all you were trying to do was survive, was just something that was just so surreal, and had never really been done in a game like this before, not to this point. The very fact that it uses different types of perspectives, like the camera angles and fixed perspectives. When you walked into a room, you knew there was something there, but you couldn't actually see it until pretty much you went around the corner and it was on top of you. And that's what scared the hell out of you the most. It really set the tone, and it executed it so well. Now, as we all know, Resident Evil 1, as perfect and all as it is, there is areas where it does have flaws, and mainly due to the likes of the acting. As we all know, it actually holds pretty much a load of records on its own for the worst acting pretty much in video games.
Who is it?
Hey, you! Stop! Run, Jill! He's insane!
But I will admit, there definitely is a few games that definitely do give it a run for its money, and some of the sequels and spin-offs will definitely do that, mainly in the likes of the Gun Survivor series. If you've ever actually played them, especially the first Gun Survivor, even the likes of Dead Aim, they've got questionable styles of voice acting as well. But it's not to take away from the games themselves, they were actually quite good, just the acting definitely left a lot of questions. Resident Evil 1 also got another remake on the Nintendo DS under the name of Deadly Silence, and it uses all the likes of the touchscreen features as well, so there was definitely a lot of really cool elements. Plus it actually had improved graphics and had a lot of other different gameplay elements as well, so it definitely added to it, even with another version that did eventually come out on the Game Boy Color by the name of Gaiden, where you played as Leon and Barry. It was actually the first game pretty much before Revelations 2 to be actually where you got to play as Barry. So even though it's very different, but it's still pretty cool to actually see games like that on those formats. But with the popularity of Resident Evil 1, it led on to a load of sequels and spin-offs, mainly with the likes of Resident Evil 2, which in fact had a prototype during its early stages that is now known as Resident Evil 1.5, which was eventually scrapped because Capcom felt that it wasn't adhering to the plot or the initial storyline of where they wanted to take Resident Evil. So it led on to the Resident Evil 2 game that we now know and see today, and is considered to be one of the best and all-time greatest survival horror games ever made. Even with its direct sequel, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which, even though it is a little bit more on the action orientated side in its own right, is equally probably one of the most scariest games ever in the franchise with the Nemesis. Easily the most formidable opponent pretty much in any Resident Evil game. Just knowing that sound of the Nemesis when he shouts stars, and even the background music in the game when he was actually around, it was so creepy and so eerie that you just never knew where he would actually show up, and you were just biting your teeth literally on tenterhooks, just hoping that you could get through an area without him showing up, and when he did you would panic, so you'd try to either run away from him or tried to find the nearest save room, because it was the only chance you'd actually ever have of trying to get away from him and survive. Because the chances are, if you didn't actually have the right weapons on you at the time and you tried to engage in a fight with him, chances are you were gone. You had no chance against him. That game is just, even to this day, even when I hear that music, it still puts hairs on the back of my neck. It is so terrifying. It's just, it's not even funny. But that'll tell you how good the franchise is in general. Like with Resident Evil 1, a terrifying game, and then for the sequels to be just as terrifying in their own right. Then for years later to make remakes of each of the first 3 games, with mainly Resident Evil 1 remake, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. And they're all graphically superior games with incredible visuals, but they're equally as terrifying. But in saying that, the remade version of Resident Evil 3 does have questions hanging over it. It wasn't as well received compared to the original title, because a lot of elements from the original game were left out, and that's what left a lot of hardcore gamers kind of a bit deflated in the terms of its offering. But it's not to say that it's a bad game. It's actually a fantastic game, but it's not, even in my opinion, as good as the original game, because the original game is easily one of the most terrifying games I've ever played, ever. It's just so iconic. Even with the Resident Evil 2 remake, it actually took the elements from what was already a terrific and pretty much one of the best games ever made and actually made it better, which you'd be thinking to yourself, how is it even possible to do that? But the Capcom managed to do it. It's just an absolute fantastic title. Improved visuals. It uses the same over-the-shoulder perspective as what's seen that started with Resident Evil 4 and later Resident Evil 5 and 6, and it just somehow works, and it's equally as terrifying, if not more so, than the original. A lot of it I think has to do with the actual tyrant itself, because the tyrant is even more deadly and terrifying pretty much throughout the board, because you don't just meet him at certain points. Once you initially meet him, you never know where he's going to pop up. It's very similar to the Nemesis in the original Resident Evil 3 on the PlayStation 1. He roams around the area and you know he's there. You can hear like footsteps and you can hear doors opening inside the police station, which is so creepy. And then when he actually does appear, to make things even more terrifying, if you manage to, depending on what versions of the game that you actually bought, you could gain access to the original soundtrack, which it was terrifying in its own right, but when it's actually used with the new version of the game, it really ramps it up to a whole new level. Like, to meet the tyrant and to have that music playing, it's just, it really is just absolutely just chaos. And I didn't think that games like that could actually scare me again, and I remember when I played it, I was like, holy crap, this is just, it's just like you're reliving all those old moments again, and it truly is terrifying. But it's a testament to show how good the game actually is, that they took something that was already great and they just made it better, and it truly is a masterpiece, and quite rightly so, because it was considered to be one of the best games of 2019. It truly is an incredible title. So with all those games in the series, eventually leads on to the likes of Resident Evil 4, which was the first game to kind of go away from the original style of the fixed camera perspectives that you've seen in Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, even with Code Veronica that was out on the likes of the Sega Dreamcast, GameCube and the PlayStation 2. Resident Evil 4 moved away from that and used the over-the-shoulder perspective, which pretty much has become the staple in the Resident Evil franchise since then. Now, the game does focus more on action-orientated elements, but it has its own kind of elements where it does have like its own creepy kind of or take on the story itself, but it's more action orientated, so there's a lot going on. Like, the game is humongous in size, the amount of areas that you actually go through throughout the game, but there's so much action in the game that sometimes it doesn't leave you feeling the terror that you would actually feel in the older games, because the older games, even though there was action elements in it, it was a lot more slow paced, and that pretty much continued on with the likes of Resident Evil 5 and 6, which kind of used the same aesthetics but tried to add a bit more to the whole play style, because with Resident Evil 4 you were only able to play with one character, with Leon Kennedy from Resident Evil 2, but Resident Evil 5 and 6 you got to play like as Chris Redfield, and he had a character with him with Sheva Alomar, and it was the first Resident Evil game to pretty much be based with online co-op and have proper online multiplayer. The only other games that saw multiplayer before that were the likes of the Resident Evil Outbreak games that were out on the PS2, but only in North America and Japan did we actually get access to the likes of the online features, or in Europe they never actually got access to the online features. That element was removed from the game. So Resident Evil 5 and 6 you were able to play co-op pretty much with anyone kind of online, and you could go through the campaign, and they had loads of different game modes. So Resident Evil 5 reprised the role of Chris Redfield, trying to stop a new spread of the virus, but also trying to find the whereabouts of Jill, because she was gone missing or was presumed dead. Then with Resident Evil 6, it took a kind of slightly different direction, where it actually had 3 stories pretty much in one, which was a first for a Resident Evil game, where it was 3 games in one, each with their own kind of elements to it. They all used the same play style, where they had the co-op elements and over the shoulder shooting, but they added in their own kind of style. But it was also the first game really in the franchise to kind of come at it from a different perspective, where it kind of went into the more mental side of some of the characters, mainly with the likes of Chris, because he had gained a few injuries and it left him suffering with amnesia, and he started drinking heavily because he couldn't remember certain events, or he didn't want to admit that he was at fault for some of the issues too. And that was the first time where the story had actually really gone into the mental aspect of some of the characters. Even though the game itself wasn't as well received, it still did a really good job of actually telling the story from those kind of perspectives, which was something that wasn't really touched on in the Resident Evil games up to that point. So after Resident Evil 6, there wasn't too many games pretty much that came out for a while, apart from like say the remakes. But then eventually then in 2017 we got a whole new take on Resident Evil with Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, where you play as Ethan Winters, and the game goes into first person, so it kind of takes on the first person perspective. So again, the Resident Evil franchise goes through a whole other change. So what started off with the likes of the fixed camera angles went to pretty much third person over the shoulder perspective, and then to first person. And more than likely this is going to be the way that Resident Evil is going to continue to go on in the future, because first person survival horror games really have kind of hit a home run over the last 10 years, and there's been a lot of clones and other like really good titles like Outlast and a load of other games that came out on different systems that have really solidified how good survival horror in first person actually is. So Resident Evil 7 wanted to actually have a go at that, and it's also quickly become one of the best in that genre as well, which leads on to the upcoming Resident Evil 8. As of recording this video, it hasn't been released yet, but there are demos starting to appear, and it's only a matter of time before the game will actually be released. So again, it continues on the story of the same protagonist, Ethan, from Resident Evil 7, and it's going to continue on his journey. So it's going to tell a load more aspects and elements from the Resident Evil story, and you also get to see and revisit Chris Redfield, although this time he is more of an impromptu role in the game, because we don't know for certain whether he's actually a good guy or a bad guy in this game. We don't know what's really kind of going on, only from what we've seen from the likes of certain elements and news online. So it'll be interesting when the game comes out to actually play through it to see what's actually going to happen, but at the same time it'll be one of those things you'll just have to play it and witness it for yourself whenever the game is actually released. But in saying that, apart from all the major games within the actual series, there have been a lot of spin-offs in the Resident Evil series over the years. There has been likes of the Gun Survivor games, which was Capcom's first attempt at doing first person survival horror, but they used the likes of the light gun games. So there was the first Gun Survivor game, which in itself is a decent game, but like I mentioned at the start of the video, definitely gives Resident Evil 1 a really good run for its money in terms of probably the worst voice acting ever, because the voice acting in that game, yeah, definitely is questionable, but at the same time it doesn't take away from the gameplay.
Where am I? Oh!
It is good, it's clunky, but it's still good, and if you are a fan of Resident Evil, all the Survivor games are worth a play through, even with the likes of Survivor 2, which pretty much is more of an arcade focused game, because it takes all the elements from Code Veronica and just kind of makes it into more of an arcade shooter, so it doesn't really tell a story, but it's still worth the play through as well. And then even with Dead Aim, which was the last of the pretty much those type of Gun Survivor kind of games, alongside the Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles that were released on the Nintendo Wii and later released on the PlayStation 3. And like the original Gun Survivor game, it pretty much retells a different story, like kind of like a spin-off, and it goes off in a different direction with different characters, but it still kind of ties into the whole Resident Evil universe. It's still a decent enough game in its own right, and it's worth to play through if you haven't played it already. But again, if you really want to kind of get a full inkling into the series, you would be better off revisiting all of the original games in the series, even back as far as even Resident Evil 0, which was even a prequel to Resident Evil 1, where you played the role of Rebecca Chambers and you played through her progress and leading up to the mansion incident within Resident Evil itself. There definitely is a really good way of telling the story and how to fit all the characters in throughout the storyline. So there's definitely a lot there that you should look into if you are a long time fan, or even if you are new to the Resident Evil series in general. I would highly recommend that you start from those early games and work your way through all of them so you can get an idea for some of the stories. Even to watch some of the CGI movies as well, like Resident Evil Damnation, Vendetta, Degeneration, and the upcoming Netflix series, and even the movie reboots and so forth. It'll give you an idea as to what the franchise is about. There was other spin-offs as well in terms of Resident Evil Revelations 1 and 2, where you reprise the roles of some of the bigger characters in the likes of, with the first one playing as Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine once again, and then with the second Revelations game where you got to play as Claire Redfield again from Resident Evil 2, Code Veronica, but you also for the first time in the series actually got to play as Barry Burton. So that was actually a really cool feature, because a lot of fans had actually wanted to have that element to be able to play as Barry, so at least we got that opportunity. But when you look at the long history of Resident Evil games, there have been a lot of other kind of spin-offs and even loads of cancelled projects and titles. Even like with the likes of Resident Evil 1.5, the early version of Resident Evil 2, there was also other like beta prototypes and other cancelled versions of the original Resident Evil that actually were supposed to be released on the likes of the Game Boy Color and other kind of like handheld consoles. There are prototypes that you can look for online. If you search online, you'll be able to find like images and resources regarding a lot of these old cancelled prototypes and so forth. So they're definitely worth a look just to kind of see the developers' ideas of the Resident Evil games and what they actually tried to do with the hardware back then. So it is pretty cool just to kind of dive into that history. But all in all, when you look back at the history of Resident Evil, it's actually hard to believe that what started back in 1996 is now, currently as recording this video, is 25 years old, and it truly is an incredible franchise. It's had a lot of ups and downs, but it has stood the test of time, and it has had somewhat of a resurgence over the last 3 or 4 years, and it definitely looks like it's definitely going to get a lot better over the next while, with some of the titles that are being released and even announced that are in the works. So it's an exciting time to be a Resident Evil fan, and if you're not, I highly recommend that you jump into it, because if you go back and play the original games, and even as a fan to revisit all those old memories like I have done, from going back to playing the first game and it being one of the very first games I'd ever played on the PlayStation 1, I'll never forget that. The first time you even got to see that zombie in the mansion and literally just being in that environment, and for it to be as chaotic and as scary as it is. And even then with the sequels later on, with Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, Nemesis mainly, with the likes of the Nemesis and just the music itself. The one thing the Resident Evil franchise definitely gets right is the tone and the music that actually is in the game. It is perfect, it suits it so well, and it really does set the vibe, and it just creeps you out. It genuinely is the pinnacle of survival horror, and you can see why so many games and clones have been made from other developers, even in other franchises all throughout the years, because Resident Evil is the benchmark for everything that comes after it, and it will remain to do so for a very long time. So whether you're a fan of the games, or even if you're not a fan, go back and play them, go and check them out, play them from the start and play them the whole way through to get familiar with the story. I highly recommend you do, you won't regret it. There's some phenomenal titles here, some of them you may not even have ever heard of, that you should actually have a look into, and you'll be pleasantly surprised how good they actually are. So I highly recommend you check them out. And I'd love to know your thoughts on any of the games I've mentioned here in this video, if you actually have played them yourself, and even which is your favourite Resident Evil game, and even which console did you enjoy playing the games on the most. Be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, and if you'd like to see more videos like this discussing other games similar to the Resident Evil series, or even other style of horror games and other genres and franchises on the PlayStation, make sure to subscribe to the channel, and again hit that bell icon to be updated whenever I release future videos. Also be sure to check out the videos here on screen with other reviews and gameplay videos of other similar games that were released on the PlayStation. And until next time, make sure to keep playing those classic games and enjoying them, and keep those gaming memories alive.